Are we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not.
Hi there, and welcome to Better Than Not, the podcast that aims to capture shifting perspectives and thought-provoking ideas in conversation, based loosely on my series, A Changing Frame of Reference, which you can read on the Substack app, and I hope you will, as it might give you some insight into what this podcast is all about. I'm your host, Doug Gardam, and today it's a pleasure, very excited for this conversation today. I welcome back, first time in video, Mr. Todd Leyden. Todd, how are you?
I'm doing great today, Doug. It's great to be with you.
Oh, it's great that you can join us today, and it's kind of cool to do this in video this time. Todd is the executive director of Fort Wildness, which is one of the largest Christian camps in the United States, and a very popular one. He is also the author, and this is kind of how we met, of a book entitled Eyes of the Father. It's a deep book, and it's a book of his experience, an extraordinary book of his experience in losing his son, Payton. And I was going to say it's quite a story to read. And in the last podcast we did, Todd relayed a lot of that to us in a very, I'll say, articulate but emotional way. And what I wanted Todd to come back for, because we have subsequently met in person. Todd was on the West Coast in December with his wife, and he actually came up towards where we live, and we sat down and had coffee with our wives. And an extraordinary man. Todd, I don't know more than I can say other than what we're going to talk about in our conversation today.
Well, Doug, we certainly enjoyed meeting Laura and you. That was a great blessing to us, and I think that God, one of the greatest gifts he gave us was the gift of relationship. And so these indiscriminate opportunities that we think to get together are very meaningful to me. But an aside for your listeners is, it was my first time ever to the northern part of Washington. And I said to my wife as we were driving up towards Vancouver to meet you, why is it so busy on a Sunday afternoon driving to Canada? Like, how can it be this busy? What's going on? The next morning, we realized that was Taylor Swift's last concert in North America, and we were in a traffic jam with the Swifties. So
that was kind of a crazy time, because even in meeting you, we were an exceptionally long time crossing the border from Canada into Washington. And we were kind of surprised, and we really didn't allot enough time for us. But both of us got kind of caught up, so you were there a little ahead, I think. But we met and had a super coffee and conversation, which prompted me to invite you back, because your world has changed quite a bit since your book came out. I've read the books since then. I think in the last podcast I entitled it The Epitome of Faith. And I think in our conversation and what we talked about, I was now kind of intrigued on how things have changed in your world. But that's only kind of the beginning, shall we say, and what this is. But you're now very involved with this camp, Fort Wildness. That's correct, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And it takes as I understand, it takes like an enormous amount of your time in trying to put this together, and not to mention a huge change of life of moving kind of from an urban area into, well, like the camp's name, wilderness. Yeah.
Well, it certainly is a story or a journey that we would have never embarked on. We'll unpack it a little bit as you would like. Essentially, prior to coming up to the Northwoods, we had camped at this camp since the late 90s. Before coming to the Northwoods of Rhineland or Wisconsin, which literally, for the listeners, our nearest Costco is 3 hours away. So the nearest city of any size is probably an hour and 15 minutes. So we're about an hour south of Canada, up in the northern part. But my point being is that I had worked at the NCAA. I was responsible for all the initial eligibility work for the NCA. There's a story behind that. But God made it clear that we were called up here. And so the head of communications, the NCA, when he found I was leaving, he was a friend of mine. He said, "You're going from the limelight to the no lights." And I thought that was very apropos. And so, Doug, yeah, it's a great privilege here, because back to the story about our son, when Payton was the sickest kid at Riley Children's Hospital, our prayer was first and foremost for God to be glorified. And what I've said in recent years to people here, it's come to the realization that God has answered that prayer, because we have seen the impact and the unfolding, glorious unfolding, as our mutual friend Keith would say, of the Lord's plan through us being here, which is not the least bit ironic, because my wife loves cities and would love to. Our son lives in New York City for now, and that's her favorite place in America. And so that is the opposite of where we live. So yeah, it's been a great journey, and we're getting to see just a place where we can impact a lot of lives in real meaningful ways, particularly the struggles and challenges that are going on today with families and young people.
When you kind of first left there, like a big part of it was what happened with Payton and shifted your life in many ways. When you arrived there, like to Fort Wilderness, like what was it like? Like, can you like describe, like, because you're really making an enormous transformation in your life, not to mention dealing with the loss of your son.
Yeah. So we had lived in Indianapolis for 32 years. So you get rooted in the community. Obviously, the nature of my work, just by backdrop, in Indianapolis, was fairly high profile at times, from being the leader of initial eligibility for the NCAA and college athletics, to in my consulting life of led the first base privatization in U.S. history, which saved a couple thousand jobs, to leading a really high profile effort for the mayor, with launching Indianapolis in a different direction towards high technology economic development. So I did a lot of those types of things. And so between that and Payton's passing in the early 2000s, where it was very visible, I mean, it was seemingly everybody knew. It was covered in the press. It was an unusual situation. And so, we had that take place and so forth and so on. So then when 2016 came and a friend of mine said, "Todd, you need to apply for this job at Fort Wilderness." I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I'm not a camp guy. I've gone to camp. I'm not a camp guy." And he said, "Todd, here's what they need." And he listed 5 things. And in as much those were the things that were needed, because this camp had a great mission and they had done extraordinarily well. They'd grown a fair amount, but like a lot of not-for-profits, or in this case, Christian camp, it takes a lot to run it and run it well, and to build the organizational capacity and competence. I'm a consultant, so those buzzwords, to be able to let it to thrive going forward. And so there was that aspect. And then for my wife, it's like, what do I do?
Really?
My whole life has been totally changed. I know we're supposed to do this, but like, seriously, I mean, I would tell my friends back home when we first got here, I said, I will see more deer on the way to work than I will see cars. So, that's certainly a difference.
And for many people, I mean, seeing a deer in the wild is a pretty exceptional thing. Like, people travel a long way to see that. and here you are, like you say, passing more of them than you're passing cars. Like, just extraordinary. So how did that become, like, even for your wife, Robin, like being from the urban city, enjoying the activity there? It wasn't like you were running away from that. Plus the whole, with I'll say, grieving over Payton, like that's like parents' nightmare, and how you're dealing with all those things. Did they meld together? Did that help? Or was it just kind of a crazy time, like, as far as trying to be able to balance those? Because the part is it's been very successful since you've been there as well, whatever the word success means.
Yeah, it's a good question, Doug. And, I often wonder as the Lord leads you on your journey. I've always said that I love to walk by faith. What does that
Mm-hmm.
mean? I think the easy thing is to try to figure out, okay, if you're capable, equipped, and motivated, then here's the rung that I'm on. How do I get to the next rung, and then how do I go to the next rung and the next rung? We can all try to do that, but walking by faith is different because you may be put in circumstances and situations that this is not what you would ever anticipated for your life or your spouse or your family, or separation from friends, your church community. So, is certainly a big adjustment for Robin. Now, some time had passed since Payton had passed away, but the challenge of leaving everything that you know. So we were in Indianapolis from the time we graduated from college, and now 32 years later, we're now being dislodged to a place that, while we certainly come up here for a week during the summer, that doesn't mean that we're rooted in this community. And after our first year at camp, she had volunteered as the health services manager, and she was somewhat emotional. And that fall, she said, "I got nothing."
Oh,
And we both knew we were called here, but you don't want. She has nothing. My friends aren't here. My activities aren't here. My church isn't here. My community's not here. And so, and it's fairly rural, so it's centered around, a lot around camp. So I had nothing. So then that led to a process for her to come and take an accommodations job, very low paid, that basically meant for 5 years she was leading during the off seasons, cleaning toilets, cleaning in rooms,
oh
and
my
giving. And
goodness.
for us, being where she didn't have to work in Indianapolis, and we were in our mid 50s when we came up here. That was a big adjustment. But
Oh yeah.
what happened through that, and it's a longer story, is that God was working too, and so she started developing relationships with young people, and she has one of those unbelievable capabilities to draw into conversation with the young people where they share everything and anything, things that I don't even want, you don't want to know, right? And they share it with, and so not in a confidence role, but in a mentoring, discipling, equipping type of a role. And so that then led, with her being the health services manager, to go back to seminary about a year and a half ago, because with the mental health crisis. And so we've seen the unfolding of God's plan, but first he just needed to get her here, and then secondarily get something to do, and then thirdly to use the gifts and talents he gave her in this way, and now with further education. But my point is, if we put up the resistance and say, "No, God, why at this age do I want to take a massive income cut, leave everything, and come to the woods?" You don't see the things that the Lord might have for you. And so and she would share the same. So.
No, I can, in a way, I can relate to this. I mean, part of like a year ago, I didn't even know your name. Like I didn't know who you were. It was like one of those things that kind of came into my life through our mutual friend Keith, and just what we've already kind of communicated and teched with. I almost get to the point where I've made this statement before, but if you're not comfortable, if you're not uncomfortable, maybe we're not doing it right. If you follow what I mean. Like it's we seem to be striving for this comfort, and in striving for this comfort, I mean, we're in this world of, I'll call it epidemic of loneliness and disconnect, and in many ways doing the things that people kind of think they want to, and trying to be happy in things. And I often wonder, like, but is that really what we're here for? Like, is that really the kind of thing? And to your point, like, to me, your story is extraordinary because, like you said, you left everything that most people strive for and want to for their end goal. And look what came out of it. It's just, there's so many different things that have kind of come about in your world, as to me, you very eloquently explain and write about in your book, Eyes of the Father, as far as how that kind of comes. And now, like I said, since the book has come out and what you've continued to have to go on and how that I'll say that exploratory part, like that's why I said the juxtaposition between city urban life and living, like you're not just in the country, you're in the wilderness.
Yeah. Well, Doug, a quick aside to amplify what you just shared. It's not lost on me, and it's not about us. We're instrument that we've got a great team of people that minister here at Ford, and in lots of Christian ministries and lots of places, and there's many helping and serving organizations in our country, and I'm sure yours, and people that give of themselves. So we're certainly not the only people, but I would say twofold: the willingness to step out in faith, as we're called, and to see the response to that prayer that God would be glorified, the blessing of all the relationships and the impact that we have seen. And Doug, I'll share with you just I profiled last fall in our annual ministry update letter. We've been richly blessed with a lot of new missionary staff coming on last year, 8 alone, which is massive. And then I also said, we have 25,000 hours of volunteer labor each year, 700 volunteers that come here. And in that, I profiled 6 stories of different people, and they're all great stories and of different people and or groups that have volunteered here. But one in particular, there was a young lady that I've got to know over the years, and she has very severe, significant mental health challenges, and I know her family, but I've seen the last couple of years her just thrive and blossom. And when she's here, she is fully alive. But when she's been outside of the Fort community, she's struggled and had challenges and been in institutions and whatnot. And so I wanted to profile her story, but was not sure how to do so because it's very dramatic. And then so I called her folks, and she's 20, and they said, well, just talk to her. You know her. Just go ahead and talk to her. And whatever she wants to do is fine. And I said, okay, I'll call her, and I did. And so we had started the conversation. I'd like to profile your story and these volunteers and whatnot. And she said, Todd, but for Fort Wilderness, it saved my life.
Oh, wow.
And she'd been very literal, Doug. And so I think of that, and I just think, did literally God working through this ministry save her life? And then she called me up during the Christmas break and said, next summer when I come, I'd like you to baptize me and my grandfather.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I'm thinking, man, I didn't think I was coming up here for this. I thought, I'm just a business guy that, knows business principles, and I've run big things, and that's why I'm here. God had other things also in mind too. So.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting combination, because as we chatted at coffee that day, you bring a lot of the, I'll call organizational skill set that's required to run a large company to a place that needs it in order to flourish, and not necessarily knows that they need that. But it works. And what a unique combination of gifts that you've been given to do this. But again, if you hadn't, well, I mean, many things probably wouldn't have happened if you hadn't gone through Payton's life and dealing with that. But it's amazing what that has done to me in your life, and it's like, bring it on to me. It's one of those things. It's like you gotta. It's like I think Paul said about suffering, right? Like we can't get away from suffering. Despite what we're told all the time, like you got to be happy, our little phones and all that thing is constantly repeating it, but it's not real. And I think most of us kind of recognize that it's not real, but how do we better deal with that suffering? How do we better deal with this pain that's given us in whatever format that it comes in? It's not always a physically inflicted pain that's the most difficult. I think that's what mental illness is telling us as well. And when we can find ways to get some of the answers, it just seems like your path was clear to do this for you. And Robin, and your wife, I think it's amazing some of the things that that you've gone through. They're in similarities to us as well. I mean, 2 years ago, I would never have talked about doing a podcast. Like it wasn't even in my list of things to do. My wife deciding to go back to become a counselor, like she's been a counselor her whole life, but to like officially go in and do that type of thing. And then it's all drawn to me from this whole thing of finding out like you can't do this alone. And I've written about this. It's just something like no matter how I look at this, you just can't do it alone. I had nothing to do with getting into this world, and where in my activity process, I think a lot of from education gives me this sense that I am the one in control, and I'm glad that my eyes were open and my ears were open, that I started to see, no, you actually can't. To be fulfilled in this life, you just can't do it alone. You might think you can. And I think there's a lot that's given to us to make us feel that way, more than probably ever.
Yeah,
but when you begin to recognize it, and I think your story is one that just epitomizes that.
Yeah, Doug, that's very, very well said. In the book of Genesis, first book of the Bible, it says 6 times it is good. The first time it says it is not good is it is not good for man to be alone. And to what I shared earlier,
oh yes,
I think the gift of relationship is one of the greatest gifts that God gave us. And as I mentioned offline, I've started reading David Brooks, the New York Times, and he's a brilliant man.
He is.
I've read his book Second Mountain, and the benefit of community, and as opposed to the first mountain of your career success and all your things that you're trying to accomplish by yourself, and the real true joy that comes as you seek and find your purpose as it relates to your spirituality and your faith or your family or your community is one of the other three of the 4 tenets. And probably worth just for 30 seconds, because certainly we covered it in much ground on the prior discussion that we had, Doug. But just for those that have just heard, our son and Payton, our oldest son was the sickest kid in the largest acute care children's hospital. He's perfectly healthy, died from sepsis after 33 days. And in that process, certainly, I said in my book, I said, it was as if we were standing under Niagara Falls, the amount of love and support that we received from so many. And to your point about suffering, there was the verse at our camp the prior summer that the speaker shared that said from 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7, in this you greatly rejoice, though you've been grieved by various trials for a little while, which means this side of eternity, that the genuineness of your faith be more precious than gold, though it's tested by fire, would be found to praise and honor and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And that was such a foreign concept to me that we are to rejoice if we go through trials this side of eternity for some time, that by that suffering and perseverance that brings glory to God. I had no idea what that meant. None. And so certainly it was just part of it, as part of the journey. And so we all go through things in life, and we need one another, as you have submitted, to support each other and to build up and equip. We don't do life just by ourselves. It wouldn't be any fun, and it wouldn't work very well. And so,
it's funny you bring that up, because in our recent message that we had at our church, the pastor kind of went through of like, why do we go to church? And into that community answer. And it's not always as we may think for us. To your point, you don't know how you're impacting someone else by your presence being there. And that's not meant to be in a sense of any kind of hubris or arrogance.
Right.
It's just we need each other. And it comes both ways. It's a reflection, and it's like for me, it's been a stunning, a life-changing realization. for years I knew, especially in the corporate world, I knew I needed people around. I'm somewhat introverted. I like to work on my own, about obviously being a writer, and I also know I needed to have people around. How I knew that, Todd, I don't know. Like, it was just something that, and when I left that world to really pursue this, I'll call this creative thing, I recognized a few years in that was missing. And how do you fill that? And when we moved out to the West Coast, like, moved to the wilderness, we just moved to the other side of Canada. But it was through doing that like it really did change a lot of things. I mean, we went through a pandemic at the same time, and you started to become really aware of what you said about the community, and just we are not beings that do well alone. I don't know whether you've ever seen the series called Alone. It's a Netflix series, and it's got a number of. I shouldn't say it's Netflix. That might be correct. It's one of the streaming things, but it's a challenge show. I think they've done like 10 seasons now.
Wow.
And what it did is they have 20 people, and they're all like from Navy SEALs to nature lover. There's 20 of them, and they actually are inserted into these remote areas. Often it's in Canada because we have a lot of remote areas, but you could argue that as far as wilderness. But they're alone, and they can't see one another. They know nothing about one another. And what is very dramatic about it is you just see how not only the person, but like the soul of the person begins to break down. Like, you've got these, I'll call them, when I watch, it was a blow, because my wife saw it, and I said, oh yeah, we'll probably watch one episode of this. And we got so interested in the psychology of it. Because you've got these Navy SEAL guys that 30 days in, they're literally weeping over the fact that I'm spending this time to win with the chance of winning this amount of money, and I'm missing my kids and my family. And you're kind of going like, you're almost not believing it, to be honest. Because it's just, but you see it and happening over and over again. And then there's a person that just seems to flourish in that. And that's like 1 in 20, so to speak. But it's called Alone. And it was like, it's such an interesting, to me, psychological exercise. Like, we just, like, physically, well, they have to find their own food. They basically have a tent. They have to heat themselves. All those things they have to do. But there's no people.
I'll take a look. My wife, for years, haven't seen it recent. It's from Alaska, Life Below Zero. So similar premise. These people are so far off the grid. Planes need to fly in supplies, and they basically, so similar thing. But yeah, I'll take a look at that. That sounds interesting. But
it just reinforced this whole idea, and this is, to me, where I almost feel like there's something going on with the church. I know for me there's something going on, but there is that community part that you just, like, how else do you get it? Like, it's one of those things that you start participating. If you go to work every day, you get some of it through the people you exchange with and interface with. But often you don't even want to be at that work. So those are things that are challenging in that sense. And this is why, to me, I found it's so, like, we need people, to me, so bad that we'll even be confrontational with them just to get that interaction.
Well, and Doug, that's probably, if you said, well, what makes Fort Wilderness different, or what is it about Christian camping, or what is it about this that people so love this place and whatnot? The ability to create temporary community, a safe place, safe meaning not just physically safe, but emotionally safe, where you feel supported, you can be vulnerable. There's people that can come alongside you. This is not, for anybody listening, a slam at the local church. But sometimes the local church, it can feel like, well, we're either measuring ourselves against others or uh, however it is that you're viewed. Well, you come to this temporary community, and that's why you find like a number of our family camps, the same people will come year after year, or there's all sorts of things that young people will come that either on staff or camps that are unpacking things because they're part of a community where they feel supported, welcomed, and loved. And that's part of the secret sauce. And then
Yes.
how do you help them to receive the things that the Lord would have for them? So.
No, to me, it's a big plus, and you don't get, like, I will often say, like, okay, you're also talking here to a person that probably for most of my life I didn't attend church. So like, this is kind of like a relatively, when I grew up in the church, up to my late teens, did some in the early part as we started a family and stuff. But I was really bothered, Todd, by the hypocrisy. Like, that's what really affected me a lot, and kind of got to the point of realizing, well, if you're human, you're going to be hypocritical. It's just part of our makeup, whether we like it or not, I think. But we can be aware of it. But kind of
that was my number one thing growing up was hypocrisy, Doug. It just totally. But go ahead.
Well, what I came to the reason, this is all part of our move out west that was completely unintentional, but you start hearing things that start to make sense to you, and you're missing something that they start to fill in of the words, the ideas, the concepts start to fill in a void that you know is there inside yourself that you've not been able to fill in any other way. And what I started to begin to realize it's that old saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. And there's still things that I don't like about, shall we say, the church. But the things that you gain from it, and what I've kind of been able to bring into myself, do very much counteract some of the, I'll say, the smaller things that kind of irritate you, right? And kind of go on with that. And to me, that was one of our lead pastor at our church. One of his sayings are, when you find the perfect church, don't join it because you'll ruin it.
That's classic.
And part of the reason why I like it is because I remember it. I can remember it. But it's one of those things that, like, oh yeah, I'm not completely infallible either. I forgot about that. You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things. And to me, that is one of the things that became very important as I began to get further into it. Many of the things that I find fascinating, whether it be, we've talked about history, we've talked about science, psychology, all of those things I find terrifically interesting. And I think many of them lead me back to both the Bible and to God himself. But it's not there anymore as a question mark, so to speak. It's just there to reinforce it. And I think we kind of spoke about this a little early on. I think now we're at a point where there's an enormous, seems to be, drive for truth. And I think, I'll say, even some of the intellectual voices that we hear, because I've always been kind of hard on academia, because I think academia has driven us down some pretty dark and hopeless roads. But, and not going any further in those examples, I think some of the voices that you're hearing now have a much different message to say, and that there's a lot more about our Creator, the Almighty, that maybe we haven't understood. We haven't understood what this faith thing means. Like when Paul says we're justified by faith and not by works of the law. Like it's, to me, that's just this, like that. I think I shared that maybe the last time, but I found that just a profound thing that I didn't actually get till like last year. And I'm thinking, wow, this is kind of amazing that, like, why, and I'll hear from others that will tell me, Well, it's because your eyes and ears weren't opened to those words.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it's kind of like kind of an interesting thing that when that starts to, when you peel away that coding, it opens up so much to the point where, like, I'm at the point of saying the rabbit holes I go down to in those subjects like science, I was saying, they don't lead away from God, they lead to God.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm stunning. I've written quite a bit about this, of how did they get separated? Like, because for those that are struggling with that, I think they would be very helpful in understanding, like, who created you? You didn't, as an example.
Yeah, so I think that is a really
There's a
wow.
lot.
Well, no, it's really good, Doug. And I was going to try to briefly link 3 points together that I think amplify what you shared.
That's cool.
So, one is, and you talked about Paul. Um, Paul said, "To live is Christ, to die is gain. What shall I choose?" I'm hard pressed between the two. And then he goes on to say that he will choose to live because that is for the joy and progress in your faith. So he's come to the understanding after being the person that persecuted all the Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like Christians, because Christian at that time was a negative derogatory term.
Yes.
So the disciples, the followers of Christ, but he persecuted them.
Yeah.
And now he's saying, but you know what? I know it'd be better to join Christ because that's our ultimate destination. That's what we're called to do. But I'm mindful to stay on for the joy and progress in your faith. The other angle to look at this, as I mentioned, reading Brooks's book Second Mountain, and he said, we live in this culture that's self-actualization and self-driven and be your best self and all these sorts of things. And I'm maybe not a somewhat adequate job probably of articulating his point here, but he basically said, that's a bunch of garbage. He said, we're giving these young people a box of nothing.
Yes.
It's like, there's no direction, there's no purpose. It's just whatever it is that's best for you, go do it. But how do you know what's best for you? What direction do you aim? Do you just, do whatever? Is it just experience after experience after experience? And I'm just early in the book. It's a fascinating book. But, I said to my wife yesterday as I was reading it, I was laughing. I was saying, this is some of the most profound things I've ever heard in my life, because he's dead on right. And then the third thing is from our Creator's perspective. What's our purpose?
Mm-hmm.
What's our purpose? And he's made it very clear. And this is where, to your point about hypocrisy, because I'll put my hand up first, and we could talk about lots of things with this, but we're to love the Lord our God with our whole heart, soul, and mind, and then secondarily, to love our neighbor as ourselves.
Yes.
That was the second greatest command. And by this, Jesus said, you'll know that you're my disciples, or they'll know you're my disciples. So I remind people, in light of these just crazy, culturally confusing times, the second greatest commandment is not to make sure that somebody gets the doctrine right, or that this policy position gets passed, or whatever it is. It is to love your neighbor as yourself. And what does it mean to love your neighbor?
Yeah.
To take care of the widows and the orphan and the poor and all these things. It doesn't say, well, make sure that everything works out so that you can protect your income bracket, your neighborhood, the people that the whole Old Testament is about immigration. So, that's the whole, so, that's not the purpose of the gospel. And so those are the three bookends, I think, that speak to your point very well. There's got to be a greater purpose for us than just, like I said, when I was working in the, corporate world for many years, that you just accumulate a lot of wealth, you move to Florida, you retire and you play golf every day. That seems to me to be an insane, that's the sole purpose.
I'm with you on that. I'm not a fan of the word retirement, actually, because I think it's you described David Brooks saying an empty box to youth, I kind of think it's an empty box to age and aging and old age, because it's like you work your whole life, and whether you like it or not, you do find purpose in a lot of that work. And I think it's an enormous kind of, shall we say, struggle to kind of deal with. But at the same time, when you kind of described that as you did, I like that phrasing of finding that purpose and the empty box, because it in many ways we do. How do I say that? So I'll go back to again. I'm very I'll say visually, especially from movies and things like that. I've taken so much from movies, but we recently saw a series called The Sinner. And it has Bill Pullman, who's the star of it. I think the first episode, or the first season of it was with, is it Jessica Biel? Anyway, but I think it was the third season of it. When you talked about us having our personal truths, like that's a big thing, like where like finding your own space and being self-actuating, and you're the one that's all important to. And in it, they were two professors kind of as this, because the story really is a detective story, which things don't look like they like what happened is not necessarily what you think happened. And in the process of developing the plot, these two guys sit down and start talking about it. And it's like, and it really struck me, because I'm paraphrasing quickly here, but he said, well, what happens if my personal truth is to kill you?
Yeah.
Or I believe that I have a right to take another person's life as an example, right? And you can kind of go, and so why can your truth to be, I want to be a gardener, I want to make trees grow, and because mine is different and you don't agree with it, why is your personal truth any better than my personal truth? And it really struck me, Todd, because it was a real point. Like, if we're around choosing all our own individual and personal truths, it's a pretty messy thing. And with the right person who's discussing it, you can actually make it sound like it's okay, if you follow what I mean, right? And that's where it really struck me, is like, it doesn't work that way. Like, we know deep in our hearts that that's not right. Like there's unless there's something wrong, there's almost a morality to us that we know that that's not correct. But if you take what's being kind of touted about being, like, you're in charge of your own life. You're the one that's, if you take all those to the length, that's kind of where you can end up.
Yeah, there's a man that I worked for years ago when I was in college athletics that he was a philosopher by training. And he had been a university president, so he had been at the highest levels. And he described, upon me joining in college athletics, he said he was given the example of basically a moral principle or truth, in that you need two people to be able to come to some closure around what the moral truth is. So I would counterbalance that from a Christian perspective. And so I found in the organization there was actually, it was called, this is getting a little geeky, it's called Hegel's dialectic. But if I told you, it's A to B equals C, so A is white and B is black and C is something else. So there's always an evolution of truth, is kind of what Hegel's dialectic. And there's a philosopher, John Paul Sartre, that is described as having his feet, like, this relativism, as having your feet firmly planted in midair. And, it's like, what are you anchoring to in any of these situations? So, um, you know, God has created some absolutes, and whether we like them or not, or whether you or I, which we both have had the circumstance, have some level of personal disgust around hypocrisy, I would never be so bold to ask God why He's allowed the church to do certain things in its name, right?
Yes.
His name.
Yeah.
But these things, for whatever reason, is allowed to be happen, and certainly has caused some to stray from faith and some to ultimately come to faith in different times of life. But it's hard pressed for me as a as a God as the uncaused cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
How am I just so brilliant that I'm the arbiter that this is actually right? And in fact, Doug, what I think the higher we get in positions, and this is something I really guard against here, is we can delude ourselves. We get certain experience, capabilities. And so there's a man on staff, and I say this, I share everything with, because I don't want to get off track, like, and have some, big failure, like, not just for preserving my reputation. It impacted a lot of lives. It impacted this ministry. It impacted, so we have to be careful about that. And my son just had a promotion recently, and I literally called him the other day and just said, just recognize. I said, I don't have any concerns about this, but as you go up the corporate ladder, just have people that can speak into your life. Have people that know where those lines are, that where you don't want to compromise your integrity and your principles. And because the world is going to, and John 17 tells you this, the world loves its own, and they want, you're getting sucked into this, and you're starting to go down slippery slopes around what really is right and wrong, or what's really truth or not truth, because this is what we really want to accomplish. And that can be dangerous. Very dangerous.
Well, you can, to the point, like, and you've been down that road, like, I mean, with mathematical statistics, you can almost justify anything you want. Sure. Like depending on how you take your look at and your perspective. And this is, to me, why those types of things, it's always good to have somebody that'll be honest with you, right? Like, if you're surrounded by people that just agree with you all the time, you can get down some pretty crazy. And to me, that is, what would they say? Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that you kind of you have to kind of look at, and some of that, I think, unfortunately, seems to have to come through experience. You get tougher through your suffering. You get tougher. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Part of that statement, and trying to understand it. Also, to me, Todd, is one of the things that can be very, very frustrating. What you kind of feel in your heart, but then you see the other part of the world. You can get convinced of things that are not what you're supposed to be doing, and it's very easy to be susceptible to that, because the promises, the material promises, so to speak, are so tempting.
Yeah, when I joined the NCA years ago, Doug, I don't know why I chose to do this, but I'm sure there's a reason. But Thomas Jefferson had a quote that I loved from many years ago, and I shared this when I was introduced in starting this new unit at the NCA, and it was this: in matters of taste, swim with the current; in matters of principle, stand firm as a rock. And in life, I found that there's very, very few things that are so principled that you will die on the sword for, right?
Yeah.
That is like, you will lose your job, you will do whatever, you would, take a bullet per se, or whatever it is. And I was actually listening to a podcast this morning. Russell Moore, the former head of the Southern Baptist Convention, was just interviewing former Vice President Mike Pence and asking him very difficult questions. And they're both very faith-filled men. And he asked him the question about January 6th and that. And Pence said, he basically told the former president two things: I will always pray for you, and I did the right thing for our country that day. And so whether they agree or disagree, that was a line that he said he could not cross on that day. So
interesting. That's cool to hear those things kind of going on. It's funny when you express that, because since we set up to do this podcast, a lot has changed in our two countries as well.
Yes, I wanted to hear. Maybe I need to do that offline. I've heard some things, but I don't know all the inside story. But maybe that's not the purpose of the podcast today. So,
well, I was going to say I don't mind talking about it, because it seems to one kind of breeds to the other. I mean, I think it's First Peter that says to follow what your government leaders are telling you to do, right? And I don't think that's a bad thing, but it's really a strange thing that's like since Trump was won very convincingly, our prime minister, and I think this is historical, was down to see him within days at Mar-a-Lago, and then there was the announcement of the tariffs that was thrown up, right? And then there's the joke of the 51st state. And it's like, and then we have, and the way that the media spins this, to me, is the most difficult of all, because you don't really know what's real and what's not. And it's like, it's just one of those things. It's very a challenge to like, well, we'll wait and see, like what is going to go on, because right now we haven't heard anything official. And I mean, we're not in, I think it's the 20th, right? The inauguration.
Yeah. Well, if this will help you sleep any better, the David Brooks and Capehart have a weekly show in Washington, and they were recently describing kind of the exhaustion around some of these topics, and even these that you were talking about. And they said, where you start to be concerned is when you start to see actions that are taking along these things, because there's lots of stuff shared. And are these things shared, as a smokescreen for the tariff, so people don't pay attention to that stuff and other things? But nonetheless, they said when we start to see actions, then we'll be concerned about these things. So.
Well, it's I'm kind of in that I'll say that boat. I feel like, because we've seen a lot of this over the years, and I think it's really easy to get sucked into this media machine that it's probably the most powerful force on earth. And I wonder, like what is I think one of the big motivations is money, but it's one of those things that, like, just hold on for a second here. Like, what is kind of going on, and trying to almost dig deeper into some of the things that are kind of going on. But I also think that this is also a response to what we talked about earlier, and that is this drive to understand truth. Like, what is really going? Our technology is allowing us to go down roads really, really quickly on things. Some of it's false, for sure, but I think there's enough going on with very thinking people that maybe this is going, because we've gone to some crazy times in the last few years, if you ask me. So,
well, Doug, let me add a wrinkle to because it's apparent that this the concept of truth is really something that you're weighing and considering and whatnot. But one of the words that I always loved, it was the Greek word for knowledge, which is gnosis.
Yes.
And gnosis, so what it means is it's kind of the full disclosure and not hidden. So I could tell you something about myself that would be truthful, but it would not fully disclose everything that is truth.
Yes.
So that's something too for many of us is like, are we really going to disclose the full truth, or am I going to just tell you something that is truthful, but it's not the full truth?
Yeah.
And so you get into that whole element, which I think is really important, because now I think there's some discernment obviously along the way. Somebody gets a test and it might be cancer, and you go home and you tell your kids, I think I may have cancer and I may die. That's not what I'm suggesting.
Yes, right.
But what I am suggesting is, I could tell you, we had a speaker here years ago, and it had significant, to your point about the church, significant elements. It was one of the largest churches in Wisconsin, And for whatever reason, he came and he spoke and he said, essentially, for years, I was on the altar of growth and numbers and basically inflating my position through growth and through how others saw me in leading a large church.
Yes.
And he challenged the people here at that time, this was many years ago, to consider that that's not the right thing and we need to examine ourselves. And thought, wow, thought that's really good for him to share. I had a little bit of perspective on him coming into that. Thought it was a great share. Well, 6 weeks later, he's gone as the pastor of the church because he's in an extramarital affair.
My goodness.
The second one, the executive pastor had it 9 months earlier. So I'm thinking to myself, you had just told the people here 6 weeks prior, you knew that existed. You knew that 9 months before there was this issue in your church that was extraordinarily impactful, and you couldn't share the full truth. That's when somebody in those positions, in James 3:1, it says, be careful, you who teach, you'll be judged more harshly.
Yes.
You've got to, you don't want to be in that position. So he was telling truth, he wasn't telling the full truth.
Right. And like you say, when that's the case, it doubles up on you. Like it's like it's kind of and we've seen. I mean, you've seen that so many times in individuals, right? Like we just seem to be tempted in ways that we can't tolerate.
Yeah, and Doug, let me add two other things. I think this is it's kind of like, you probably know the Paul Harvey, this is the rest of the story.
Yes.
So part of the rest of the story is twofold. So obviously a devastating impact on his wife and family.
Yes.
And I'm not close with him or his wife and family, but I know them both, and they've been in our home, and so I'm aware of that. So there's that implication. But what I said to him after this all happened is, what if God allowed this to happen to you so that it kind of stripped you down to that unfinished piece of furniture? So it stripped away all the layers of paint, got you down to your bare naked, whatever thing. And now you can use that. He can use that story, if you humble and are vulnerable, for what his glory and purpose is. But it's you've gone from this to nothing, and so that's part of our journey, right?
Yes,
we all go through things, and then how can then that lead us or make us into the person that God wants us to be?
It's funny because I think I just saw something by Spurgeon to the same extent that a person has to go through real suffering before they can be truly great, or something to that point. And it's like, and it's interesting when you see that happen with people. Some never recover. Yeah. But others like change that in a very big way, right? And it's like I find it I find us fascinating, like as human beings. Like we just have so many, and we're not as predictable as we'd like to think we are. And it's really kind of changed. And that's why, to me, 2025 could be like a very interesting year for the world in many ways. I mean, we're looking at the fires in the Palisades, which is just devastating from what we're hearing up here. And yet, it's a big sway has come back to, going back, our prime minister is instantly down to seeing the president-elect, and then a premier from Alberta, Daniel Smith, yesterday or the day before went down and met with Trump on the tariffs. And it's like, to your point, like, is this really just a smoke screen? Like, is this a distraction to what's really going on? Like, it's really a hard thing to kind of, and this is why, to me, that truth is becoming, and that truth, I think we have to go back to the ancient world. That's why the scripture, to me, becomes so important for us to continually go back and reference, because it's so complex. There's so many connections between the Old and New Testament. And what you learn, like I said to me, when I learned that we're justified through faith, not through works of the law, the 2:16 from Galatians, I'm kind of going like, why am I learning that at 62 years old? Like, how come that has not been revealed to me prior to that? Like, it's like, and some will say, well, because your eyes were finally opened and your ears were finally opened. Well, that's fair enough. Is it meaningful now? It's like, even when the pursuit of this, right? Like, this whole idea of science will take us to where we have to go. And it's, when I read Galatians 4:7, where the peace of God surpasses all understanding. Like, well, we can pursue it all we want, but we didn't create ourselves in the first place. And we didn't create this world that we're living in, despite the fact that we think we control it. And I find it like, well, those answers, or help to understand those answers, keep coming back to Scripture. And I'm amazed by that, Todd.
Yeah, and Doug, it's a gradual unfolding in our lives. I mean, I shared this recently. I knocked off a project, and I was somewhat adamant to get it done, in that I had a bunch of junk, as a lot of people do, and this is in our workshop, and it got to be a mess. And I said, finally. And so I didn't, as opposed to I could just thrown everything out or just whatever. So I went through some of it, and I had a lot of old stuff. And, I saw things and goals and accountability agreements and things that I was going to do and all this other sort of stuff. And if I lived in the moment at any one of those, I'd say I'm failing. Because I can count the number of times that, I've not, stuck or diligent or disciplines or all that. But when I look at the arc, I've succeeded by God's grace. Meaning, because you start in a direction. So like to your point about being 62 and knowing a particular scripture verse or having a particular perspective. My mom was baptized here at this camp 2 years ago at 87. And so I have seen in the last 2 years, it is a change for her. And so
Amazing.
her weight, her how she engages in things are different. And she feels like she lost 87 years of her life and not pursuing or doing the right things. And well, but you know what? We have today. And so when at Payton's funeral, I said, I start out my remarks by saying, at what age is it okay to exit this world? I said he was 13. I said, is it at age 20? Is it at age 40, 60, 82, or 100? And then I compared him to my father and my grandfather, who at that time were in their 60s and late 80s. And I said, Payton was further along in his spiritual maturity and understanding than my dad or my grandfather. So,
Amazing.
To your point is, we all come from different backgrounds and perspectives. What about the person that was abused and neglected as a child, or whatever horrific thing that happened, and why was God allow that to happen? I mean, these are very deep philosophical questions that we will not likely understand this side of eternity, but we're thankful when the Lord through the Spirit does enter into our lives in such a way, and then we can see this unfolding of the things that He has for us.
It's interesting because I've heard this recently quite a bit about why does if there is a God, why does He permit these terrible things to happen? And I might have shared, but I talked a little bit about, at least in my articles around, we're doing a book study on Joshua, and it's fascinating what's in that book when you start to really delve. But that's the same as all the other books to me. It's just amazing what's kind of there. But at one point, one of the messages from the pastor that's actually being the one overseeing it is he spoke about warfare. And he kind of described warfare in the Old Testament as a flesh and blood warfare against evil. And it's hard for us sometimes to remember that, or for me, remember even to understand that it's evil that's being fought against. And we don't necessarily always understand that evil, nor do we understand that warfare. But what's really described and talked about in the Old Testament is that warfare against evil in the flesh and blood. I kind of summarize that as the material part. And then we walk into the New Testament, and we can, and really Jesus is continuing that warfare against evil, except it switches from flesh and blood material into the spiritual world of warfare against evil. And I thought this was kind of one of those profound things of how interesting that became, because I mean, through his birth, his crucifixion, and his resurrection, that brings a whole nother part that if I kind of step into the science world for a second, I kind of think that brings us into the unconscious as an example. The place that we go when we sleep, a third of our lives there. And when you look at it from a science perspective, I remember hearing this from Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist. He was listening to a neurological surgeon and an anesthetologist talk, and he said, we basically know how to turn it on and turn it off. And that's it. And I switched that back to the New Testament and spiritual warfare against evil. And I said, it's amazing that in our world today, we are still enormously in the flesh and blood and material sense. Yeah. Science has actually cut it off because they won't actually even investigate anything that's not natural, so to speak. Right. I think we're starting to venture into those worlds. But to me, this is like, again, we're back to a script of the scriptures 2,000 years old that are telling this to us.
Yeah, Doug, it's a great point. And then that is a complex topic. It's a very difficult one to understand. Oh, yeah. In my book, I write about a few situations in my life that were clearly significant spiritual elements. Even coming to camp, we joke about a little bit, but each of the people that have come to camp in recent memory have had something significantly bad or difficult happen to them when they come, and we attribute it to spiritual warfare. Yeah, and so I kind of laugh about it. Like there was, a guy that our last person to join us. He's a young guy, a great guy, and he told me that I don't know what he was doing, but he basically blew out his knee, and these all happened, and I said to Aaron, I'm not surprised because we've seen this time and time again. Somebody comes here and there is something significant negative that happens upon joining here of a spiritual warfare. And so it's and to your earlier thing too, I guess to add, there's a scripture, and I believe in Corinthians, that says the natural man does not discern things of the spirit. So to the point about your eyes being open is we're not looking for that stuff. And that's the whole reason that I entitled the book that I did, Eyes of the Father Seeing Meaning in the Mirror, because that we can, as we reflect, we can see with what the eyes of our Father are as we look and see what are the plans and purposes He had for us. It's very difficult to see those things in the moment. And so, but we also have to kind of understand it's not from our perspective either, right? So, right. I would have never said, oh, well, Lord, this would be great. Why don't we have this happen? Why don't we lose our son and we'll go on a journey and then we'll leave a community and then we'll impact some people and somebody will, be impacted by our ministry. We don't think or look like that, right? But rather, that's how God sees us, right? That's how He sees what we can do for His kingdom, for His glory, for His purposes.
And I think when you mentioned that, Todd, I think it's very hard for us to actually deal with that because we've been, I'll say for the last 200 years, with the organized education, the Industrial Revolution, that has really directed us kind of opposite to that. And, well, not kind of, it has. But I wanted to touch on when you said in the moment, because you made me think of this, I think we've talked about C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters has been a huge book for me. And he talks about time in it, and like the idea is Screwtape. Like, I think you know the book, but it's a reverse picture that he writes about. So he's writing it from the demon perspective. So it's a kind of a catch me book, because you'll read something that you kind of agree with, and then you'll go, that's not quite right, and then you reason, well, because it's from the demon's perspective. But he talks about how humans live in 3 times. They live in the past, they live in the present, and they live in the future. And I love how he brings this together, because it's like so he's talking the demon view, we want them in the past and the future, because the past they can think about, and they did something wrong, and we wish they could correct it. And in the future, that's where we worry all the time, because we're so like, you mentioned earlier, are we going to have enough to retire on? Are we going to have enough this to live on? All these things that just compound us and constantly are in our worry. But he says, where the enemy, and when he's actually referring to God, where he wants them is in the present. And you think, like, how hard it is to live in the present, because we're really not even kind of taught to do that. But if the Sermon on the Mount, certainly he's kind of expressing that to us, is to try to live better in the present. But he wants us to live in the present, because in the present, we're closer to eternity, and he wants us in eternity. And I love how that's expressed, because we're very much in a world that is all in the future often, like just so much in our plans, all the things that go on. And yet it's like, are you enjoying the present? Like, I think of a music concert, how many people are holding their phones up, filming the stage, right? You mentioned earlier on the Swifters, right? And you're kind of going, but why are you in the present? This is a live show that you're getting to experience with this performer, not on your phone. And it's like, it's just one of those things. And often I said, do those movies that are shot, those videos, ever get watched?
Yeah.
And yet, like, it's like, to demonstrate that you were actually there, I don't know, to post on Instagram. But I said, like, that's a real idea to me of not living in the present, because it's like, it's where we're at. And I just loved how he kind of, like, in the present, in that moment, and you mentioned moment earlier on, how do we get there and try to be there? Whereas the world's kind of telling us, well, you can't live in the present. You got to be worried about the future, because what could happen to you? And comes back to our earlier thing. That's the living in faith to me in many, many ways.
Well, in Matthew, it says, I think 6:34, it says, do not worry about tomorrow. Today has enough worries of its own. And
Exactly.
One of my favorite scriptures is James 4:13-16. It says, our life is but a mist, a vapor that appears for a little while. And you certainly know, and I know, as you get older, it seems like, man, it has gone very quickly, and there's much less that's in the front mirror than the rear view mirror. But then that passage in James then also goes on to say, so what does it profit a man, just to go to this city, or to make a profit? And the point is that if your focus and your aim is just a consumption oriented, that you go to this city, that city, make a profit, and then it goes, what is your life? It's a mist or a vapor. And if the Lord wills, that we'll do this or that. And the real question is, is our purpose for ourselves? Is our purpose for our career? Is our purpose to bless and to consider the rest of humanity? And the Christian scriptures are, our purpose is in relation to our Creator and in relation to other mankind. And there will be blessings that come along the way. But that's our purpose. And our purpose is not what the culture says. Because at the beginning of Romans, it talks about the Romans 12:1, about that we do not need to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind, that will offer our bodies a living sacrifice, perfectly and acceptable to the Lord, and that we will, and that's our reasonable act of service. Our reasonable, and I've always thought about that term, reasonable. Our reasonable act of service is that we're not going to conform to this world. We're going to be transformed. We're going to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, and that's our reasonable service. So, but Lord also says that He's going to take care of us, and He'll give you the things that we need, and He can count the
Yeah.
hairs on the sparrow, and all those sorts of things. So, it's really, for lack of a better word, an enlightenment to whose are we, and then if we are His, we have to make that decision. Because if we're our own authority, then do whatever we want, and when things are done, just take whatever happens, right? But if we're not, if we're His, then what's our relationship to Him? How are we called to live? And how does that matter to the rest of the people that we are in community with this side of eternity?
Well, I think it's a really hard one, like you said, with that, especially when you kind of go back. Well, in some ways it's hard, but in other ways you think back and you go like, we had nothing to do with coming into this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's like, why was I born in Canada versus Ethiopia?
Yeah. I didn't get to choose this. I didn't say, hey, no, I don't really want into this. Everybody has different experiences. I don't want to go through that. No, let me opt out. I'm on the line to come into this world. No, we don't get that choice. We create ourselves.
So what
fascinating range of things to talk about today, Doug.
What's that?
What a fascinating range of things to talk about today. I just loved it.
Well, there's another thing that I wanted to, and I don't think I asked you this coffee, but it was one of the things that came on early on in reading your book. So your book is behind your left shoulder for those watching you. That is the front cover of Eyes of the Father. But one of the things that you do very well in this book is you table a piece of scripture at the end of each chapter. When you went through that and trying to bring the experience that you eloquently wrote about, that was no doubt very, I'll say maybe challenging because there's so many personal feelings that are in it. How did you come to the scripture that you would, because when I read the scripture after the chapter, I was going like, how did you go about matching those, like to be so like connected? Did others help you? Did you do that by yourself? Like, how did you come to matching those? Because it was like, this is the end of the chapter and I'm going to make a beautiful period at the end of this paragraph with this piece of scripture.
Doug, is one of the, I love your question. One of the best questions I've heard. I'll read the one from the end of the first chapter.
Oh, cool.
I'll answer your question secondarily. And what's meaningful to me is there was a woman that was of help to me in this process, and I was on the phone with her yesterday, and so I'll get to recount the story. But the first chapter, I have just shared that our son has passed away. It's an extraordinarily traumatic event. And then the thing is, then why do you have all these chapters afterwards? Because that's the glorious unfolding of the Lord's story. But at the end of first chapter, I said the Apostle John wrote in John 14:1-4, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way you know." So that's what Jesus told his disciples. And I went on to say, Jesus is telling his disciples to trust in him. The same Jesus who was born of a virgin, lived, died on the cross for the sins of mankind, resurrected on the third day, was seen by many witnesses in the following 40 days, and then ascended into heaven. It was the most painful day of my life, yet I was comforted in this truth. Surely God loved Payton as much as Rob and I did. Upon reflection, it became clear to me in the days and years that followed that Payton's situation was part of a plan, not my plan, but God's plan for Payton's life, which extended beyond Payton's time on earth. Robin prayed and sobbed in the chapel at Riley Children's Hospital in the early hours of February 2nd, 2001, on Payton's final day. Lord, I pray that Payton's life would have meaning. To see how God answered her prayers in many ways, unimaginable, we must go back to the beginning of this improbable story. And so, I had those at the, I think far majority of them I came up with. What's really interesting is that there were about 4 or 5 people that I had read the book. Uh, but right when I got done with the book, I said to Robin, I said, everybody knows our story so well. It'd be kind of like, I don't know, pick some significant event in human history that everybody kind of has an idea of. But it seemed like everybody knew the story to some degree. I want somebody that has no knowledge of our story to read this book. And
Yes.
Robin said, well, the speaker at camp this week, his wife is an English teacher, and she, and she works at this Christian school. Maybe Kelly could read it. And so Kelly read it, and there were a couple of people that gave some really good constructive input. And I had scattered some of these principles throughout the book around certain vignettes or stories. She said, Todd, why don't you take them, have one at the end of each chapter as a capstone to the purpose of it. So then I set down the path to do that. And I have heard from people that was so meaningful and impactful, because Scripture isn't intended just that, well, I go on Sunday, I hear a scripture lesson, and then this is supposed to encourage me for my week. No, Scripture is like, okay, my son has just died.
Yeah.
Jesus told the disciples this. If I am telling you this, what I'm doing, do you not trust me? Do you not believe me? That I will bring you there as well. So I had to anchor to that truth, Doug, to say, yeah, I can't just go on Sunday or something and think that these things don't. No, this is for me, unfortunately. And so the whole variety of those at the end of chapters that just spoke so eloquently to what it was that we were living. And so it was just a great blessing. I'm so thankful you asked that question.
No, it's, to me, it was a big part of illuminating the book and connecting it to our Creator. And it's kind of what really got me to the point of saying this whole thing that happened, this, like, as you said, this, it's every parent's nightmare. It's an unbelievable tragedy that you illuminated with a faith that was unbelievable to me. And it was like, if that is so real, and it just fills your heart with love. Like, I don't know how else to explain it in a really, really tough situation. So like, it's so good you read the book.
Yeah, and I can't thank you, and I can't probably articulate this well enough, but it gets to what you talked about earlier. When I was writing this book, for whatever reason, and my background and business stuff, I mean, certainly I've had accomplishments in my life, but it really felt at many times that the Spirit, kind of like the early people, the early writers of the Gospels and the books of the Bible, that this was the Spirit led. It just seemed like at times, like, am I really writing this? Like, it seemed like, like all these things are coming together and they're working together. I'm not that good. It's like, I'm sure I have some capabilities, but I think God was really working through that in a real and profound way. So.
Well, to me, it's a book, and to be honest, one of the things that I kind of struggle with in my life is I have not been, I'll say, a lot of death hasn't been. I've been connected with a lot of close death. So when I say this, it's not necessarily with experience, but I think it's a beautiful book for people that are dealing with grief. I think that it has a way of, and I think I might have mentioned to you this the last time, but I read a book by Neil Peart called Ghost Rider. And this was about the death of he went on this 55,000 kilometer motorcycle ride, with the death of both his daughter and his wife. His daughter died in a tragic car accident, and his wife died of a broken heart. That's how he looked at it. Now, he has since passed as well. But in riding, you kind of went through this whole the up and down of getting through this grief. That time seems to be the only way that gets us through it. And your book was to me, in a very similar way of experiencing and going through that. And it feels like, to me, it's like for someone that's struggling with this, with a death that was, or even if you're not, this is a book to me to pick up, because it's just, it's so many, and with it being backed up by chapter with scripture that is like eternal, like you're connecting it with more than just our, shall we say, flesh and blood experience. So my hat's off to you, my friend. Like this is a special book. As I might have mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, my wife is actually using it in parts of her counseling. So, because she's found it very useful in how you were able to articulate tough emotions. And I think that's not an easy thing to do. I think it's, in us males, I think it's even more unusual, to be quite honest with you. But, well, I was going to say, Todd, I am taking, again, your afternoon away from you, but it's been another wonderful conversation. I just can't get over how we kind of keep going here. But we passed a lot of things. What I was going to ask here, is there anything that we haven't passed in this? We've been bouncing around about the subject, but that you would like to share, whether it be with Fort Wilderness, your experience, that like you'd like to kind of pass on to people?
Yeah, wow, we have covered a lot of ground. And Doug, thanks for having me. I enjoyed our evolving friendship and relationship and the opportunity to be with you today and talk about, the thing I admire about you is you're extraordinarily thoughtful about things that matter. And certainly as I've got to know you and listen to some of your other podcasts, you some very interesting and engaging and thoughtful conversations. So I think the world needs that. And so thank you for doing that. I guess I would close in saying, that the Lord has brought us to this place, and we're thankful to be here and to have an impact. I'll leave with this final thought. Jonathan Haidt, the social scientist who wrote the book Anxious Generation, was on all the major networks this year. Very popular social science scientist, but talking about the mental health crisis, and his conclusion, or one of his conclusions in the mental health crisis, was that we need to get young people out in creation, doing fun activities in community, in a digital detox. And then he went on to say that Christian camps were one of the best places for that to happen. And so the interviewer of the podcast, in this case was Russell Moore from Christianity Today, said, well, you're an atheist or agnostic. And so he acknowledged that despite his, he said, well, I'm becoming less antagonistic to the Christian faith. But the empirical evidence was such that a lot of what ails the world today is let's get people out in God's creation. Let's get them off of the phone, off of the social media, a digital detox, and in community. And his earlier premise was that the mental health crisis really started with the advent of the smartphones, and then it became exacerbated about the time of the pandemic. So it's a great opportunity for us to be here, and a lot of the other people that are doing camping and create spaces and places for people to do just that, and to be supported, equipped, loved, well, in a way, in unpacking some of the things that have gone in their life, so that they could be the man or the woman that God has made them to be. And so it's just such a blessing to be able to do that. So thanks for asking.
Well, to me, I haven't been to your camp. I have an open invite, I know. We're trying to figure out how to put logistics together to make that happen. But my daughter said that, and she was at camp very early on, and she still doesn't think that there's anything like Bible camp that brings the knowledge, the feeling, the sense of faith to young people like camp does. She says there's just nothing else like that. And I thought,
relationships,
And so, I mean, hats off to you and what you're doing, and may it thrive as it's thriving now. And you've been put in this place, I think, for a reason. So I do hope you write another book.
Well, thank you. We'll see. Yeah, that would be, we'll see.
Well, Todd, I can't thank you enough for, again, being on Better Than Not. Thank you for joining us today. And again, Todd's book is Eyes of the Father. And I'll tell you, this is a book you can get on, I think you can get it, Todd, like in all of the Barnes & Noble in Canada here at Indigo, Amazon, all the normal places that you get books.
Yeah.
But I think you'll find it a very good read, especially if you're dealing with some tough things in your life. And with that, Todd, thank you. Stay on for a minute. And again, thanks for coming and joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Thank you.
Are we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not.